Now, you were hampered, in fact, were you not, by the difficulties over rebuilding the engines and using the same old materials over again?
In addition to our continuing financial problems, we had many others problems, including one string of engineering problems, like having to use the same parts over and over again when they ought to have been scrapped. And of course that was linked with the finance, because we couldn't afford new parts. We had to make do and furbish up damaged parts. And by the time we'd finished with the original engine, WU, in 1941, it was just a heap of scrap, really.
From 1939, 1940, the Ministry of Aircraft Production, Air Ministry, take over and finance the whole project. Does that mean a decisive leap forward in your affairs?
The Ministry began to give a little help in 1937, after they'd seen the engine run, but very limited help. You know, the total contract, bits and pieces amounting to about £5,000. Then they paid for a reconstruction of the engine. That cost £2,400. And but there, you see, there was another catch-22 situation, 22 situation developed, because as soon as we went on to the accepted contracts, we went on to the came under the Official Secrets Act, and that meant that we couldn't tell people what we wanted their money for. You can't go to someone and say, "Look, we've got a damn good idea. Would you let us have some money? We can't tell you what it is." But it's very good. No, we couldn't do it. And so we had to put up with what we could get from the Ministry. There was a little extra help in that the BTH accepted shares to the extent of £2,400 instead of payment. That helped.
In 1939, 1940, the Air Ministry and MAP, they assume full responsibility, don't they, and assume full financing. Did that mean a very rapid increase in the pace of the programme?
Well, when the Air Ministry began to control the project, more or less, from 1939 onwards, but that didn't mean that we got lots and lots of money. We didn't. It still came along in dribs and drabs. You know, we would get £2,000 for plant, a few £1,000s for extra test house and so on. And it wasn't until 1942 that they really made a reasonable contribution in the way of paying for a new factory near Whetstone.
Fine. So you war, yes, but you don't exactly go into top gear. And this is where your association, not only with BTH, your association with the Rover Car Company begins. Can you tell me how that came about?
Our early association was all with the BTH at the beginning. They were our subcontractors, of course. We were responsible for the design, or I was, and but the work was being subcontracted to the BTH. Though we were building our own little workshop while this was going on, but we couldn't possibly cope with making all the parts for the engine, especially things like turbo blades and a lot of precision machinery. And so we, not being very happy with the conditions in the turbine factory, where there was no adequate precaution against dirt, dust, and the factory wasn't temperature controlled, and they were not used to doing things to within half a thousandth of an inch. We were looked around for an additional subcontractor and decided on the Rover Company. The reason being that we met Maurice Wilkes, the chief engineer at the Rover Company, because his wife had been a schoolgirl friend of the wife of Tinling, one of our directors.
And they were originally brought in purely and simply as another subcontractor, were they?
We intended that the Rover Company should be subcontractors and only subcontractors, but unfortunately they went behind our back to the Ministry and tried to get direct contracts, and eventually they succeeded in doing that. And instead of being subcontractors to us, they in effect became competitors who had the advantage of having all our information handed to them on the orders of the Ministry.
Well said. I just go back on one point. Not back. I don't mean that, but just in parallel. Could you say that about this time? Could you tell me something about this time about the Rolls-Royce company being drawn into the picture as well?
And I didn't really want Rover to be interfered to the extent that they attempted to do, of course, but I wanted Rolls-Royce, and I asked Sir Henry Tizard to bring Rolls-Royce into the job. And he said no, they wouldn't be interested. They're busy with their own project. This was a scheme by Dr. A. Griffith called the CR1.
Which in fact was extremely complex and didn't get anywhere.
The CR1 was a very complicated piece of machinery, and it was full of engineering flaws, and it just hadn't got a hope.
It's a little out of sequence, but let's turn now to the USA. How were they brought in on the project?
In 1941, of course, the international situation was very tricky. We were getting plenty of bombing, and there was obviously a pretty considerable risk that we'd be bombed out, or even have paratroopers dropping on the place. So, quite rightly, I think, the Sir Henry Tizard contacted the Americans with the idea of having production started in America as a backup to what was happening in England. As a result of his discussions and other negotiations that went on that I don't know too much about, we sent a set of drawings of the later engine, the W2B, the W1X engine, which we had first used in the E-28 just for taxiing trials, and a technical team, one engineer and two technicians, to the United States, where General Arnold, Hap Arnold, had selected the General Electric Company to do the job because of their experience with turbochargers for the right engines.
The Americans received the engine, in fact, from the hold of a Liberator, didn't they? What happened then?
We shipped over the engine in parts in the bomb bay of a Liberator, and also with the team, who were horribly frightened lest the pilot should pull the wrong lever and they'd all drop into the Atlantic. But anyway, they got there safely. That was on October the 1st of 41, and the Americans did a remarkable job then, General Electric. They had that engine, their engine, version of the W2B, called the Type I, on test in April of 42, so just rather less than 6 months, which is astonishing. And even better than that, 6 months later, the Bell Aircraft Company had their twin-engine jet flying before our twin-engine Meteor.
Is this a tribute to the Americans as development engineers or as production engineers?
This, their success in this field was based on their skill as development engineers. Of course, when they went into production, they made a good job of that too.
In fact, it's an oddity, really, considering the distances that have to be travelled in the States and the advantages of the jet. It's an oddity that the Americans themselves didn't think of a jet engine.
I don't know what the Americans had done before that, really, except for the General Electric's work on the turbocharger, which was, as a piece of mechanical engineering, was very similar to a jet engine, but of course it was just used in conjunction with the piston engine.
And didn't make the final step of putting a combustion chamber between the compressor and the turbine, presumably.
I've heard that the designer of that turbocharger was kicking himself later on.
It was not only in the USA that a decision was taken to disperse or diffuse information, wasn't it? In this country there was a body called, I think, the Gas Turbine Collaborative Committee.
The gas of 1941 was notable for another reason, as well as sending the engine to America, and of course the first flights of the aeroplane. It was also notable for the formation of the Gas Turbine Collaboration Committee, the purpose of which was to bring all the firms together and pool their information at regular meetings. And that was quite a successful setup, chaired by Dr. Harold Roxley Cox, as he was then, Director of Special Projects at the Ministry. He's now Lord King's Norton.
The idea being to give the other aero engine manufacturers an entree into the jet business.
the whole object of the Gas 7 Collaboration Committee was to amplify what was already going on before. See, we power jets had to supply all our drawings to Vauxhalls until they dropped out, de Havilland, Rover, but not Rolls-Royce, because they hadn't yet come into the picture to that extent. But the Gas 7 Collaboration Committee was to coordinate all these efforts, and it included people like this Joseph Lucas, who were subcontractors to Rover on combustion apparatus.
This must have made you feel, the whole team feel, pretty vulnerable, really, wasn't it?
All this, of course, is putting power jets into a weaker and weaker position from the commercial point of view. But then we had to swallow, because it was a wartime situation, and I and several other of my team were serving officers, and we had to put national considerations before commercial considerations. That was very dominant in my mind.
Although you would have liked to manufacture during the war, if possible, would you?
I always wanted to include manufacturing in our duties in power jets. That meant a considerable build-up, but at least I thought we should get what I call pilot production. That is a run of a sufficient number of engines to determine what the production processes should be. And we did, in fact, have a limited equipment for that job. For example, we built 40 W2700 engines, but there was never any real hope that power jets would be given full production.
I'll come to the E-28 now. The plane itself was a very simple plane, wasn't it? Rather delightful, I gather.
The E-28 was designed by the Gloucester Aircraft Company. I had hoped that it would be a subcontract from power jets, but in fact it was a direct contract from the ministry. But that worked fine, because we had no problems with Gloucester. We got on very well with them, and they used our advice. We went along with them, and the RAE helped too. They did the wind tunnel test and so forth, and the building of the E-28 was a pretty smooth process.
I'll bring you to the taxiing trials now and ask you whether, in fact, you were able to participate at all, or whether you were standing on the sidelines at Gloucester watching.
At the beginning of 1941, the airplane was ready, but we hadn't got an engine for it. They were just a bit ahead of us. And so we decided to let them have the W1X, which was a kind of lash-up. It was built of spares from the real flight engine, called the W1, and parts which had been scrapped. And we put this together and called it the W1X, meaning W1 experimental. And it did pretty well on the test bench. And we put that in the aeroplane in April of 1941 and did the taxiing trials, in which I took part. I taxied it myself up to just short of takeoff speed.
I believe initially that it wouldn't move on the wet grass, and there was a lot of apprehension among the crew then.
When Jerry Sayre, who was the test pilot, first started the taxiing trials on the evening of the 6th of April, he was rather depressed because we'd set his throttle stop at 12,500 RPM, I think it was, at which the thrust was very low. The grass was wet from rain and soggy, and he was going more or less uphill too, so he only did about 20 miles an hour, and he was quite depressed. He thought there wasn't a hope. But of course we knew that as you increase the engine speed, the thrust climbs very rapidly. And in fact, when I taxied it with the engine set for 16,000 RPM, it got up to 60 miles an hour without much trouble at all. And maybe if that hedge had not been approaching me so rapidly, I might have left the ground, but I would have been court-martialed probably if I had done.
Good. In fact, Jerry Sayre did leave the ground, didn't he? He did a runway hop.
Jerry Sayre then did runs at 16,000 RPM and left the ground for 3 hops, I believe it was, of about 200 or 300 yards each, just a height of about 6 feet.
In fact, I think you say in your book that it was a thoroughly unairworthy engine, but it was quite safely managed. I think you said in your book that it was a quite unairworthy engine, but nonetheless it was a safe...
The W1X, of course, should not have flown at all. It was officially unairworthy.
I come now to the first flight, which is very significant indeed, obviously. You were on the day, I believe. You were in the office not expecting anything much to happen.
When we were ready for the first flight, we shipped the Augusta shipped the aeroplane up to Cranwell under covers, and I and some of my colleagues went to Cranwell to see the first flight. Well, the weather wasn't at all good, and it looked as though that was not going to work out at all. We'd been out the day before for some taxiing trials, and then on May the 15th, the weather looked as though it wasn't going to work out. So I went back to Lutterworth, and then we got a message to say that the weather was clearing, so I rushed back to Cranwell again, and in the evening Jerry Sayre did the flight. He was present. Jerry Sayre was sitting at the end of the runway, and party of us was sitting just to the right, and he held it on the brakes and ran out the engine to full speed, released his brakes, and then he hopped off in about 600 yards. Quite an impressive takeoff. Then he held it down level and then climbed. Disappeared into the clouds then.
Quite a new sound in the sky, I presume.
It was a new sound in the sky, yes. Naturally, people in the area hadn't heard that particular kind of noise before, and you couldn't really hide it, however secret it was supposed to be.
And in fact, word got round that there was something mysterious going on, didn't it?
There were all sorts of stories started when the first flight occurred. One officer was said to have asked another one, "How does that thing work, John?" And John replied, "Oh, it's easy, old boy, it just sucks itself along like a hoover." Another story was that someone who claimed to have been an eyewitness said there was a Merlin engine inside the hollow fuselage with a little propeller. And he'd seen it. He was a reliable witness, he claimed. And so it went on. Another story was that it went up vertically, belching flame, which of course it didn't.
Sayre was very happy with the first flight, wasn't he? I think he took it around in a long curve. Or can you tell me anything about the statistics?
Jerry Sayre took the aeroplane up for about 70 minutes was the official time. And we didn't see him for much of the flight. We could hear him, of course. And then we saw him coming in, doing quite steep gliding turns, as though he'd been flying that aeroplane for months before. Obviously, he had complete confidence.
What was the feeling among the spectators on the ground, of whom you were one?
We, of course, were the small group of us that were there, no one of any importance, really. And we were quite thrilled, of course, though I would have preferred it to have been the Meteor, which was then on the stocks, because that was a combat aeroplane, whereas the E-28 was just an experimental aeroplane. However, one of my colleagues, Pat Johnson, W.E.P. Johnson, slapped me on the back. He said, "Frank, it flies." And in the tension of the moment, I rather rudely said, "That was bloody well what it was designed to do, isn't it?"
But the landing was perfect, no problems at all.
When the E-28 came in from the series of gliding turns, it made a perfect landing.
And I think that it was only a matter of days, very quickly, and I'd like to cover this quite in some detail, only a matter of days before it had worked up to a very high maximum speed, and that also you were able to do this without taking the covers off the engine at all.
After that first flight, there were a series of subsequent flights. I'm not quite sure how many, I think probably about 14 or 15 during the next 2 weeks, up to a total of 10 hours for which the engine had been cleared by the ministry. And quite a lot of useful work was done. The ministry had restricted the speed to 16,500, at which the thrust was 860 pounds, and at which thrust its top speed was of the order of 380 miles an hour. And no, rather less than that. But the ministry gave us permission to open up to 17,000 just for one flight. And at that engine speed, it did 375 or 380. Anyway, it was faster than the Spitfire. Subsequently, in those trials, it did better.
Did you hear the thing that I came across the other day, that at this stage Churchill ordered 1,000 Whittles immediately?
I didn't, in fact.
It's true, actually. He minuted the Ministry of Aircraft, the Minister of Aircraft Supply, and said, "Why don't we have 1,000 Whittles immediately?" Behind, however, the first flight and behind the huddle on the runway, there did lie something of a crisis, didn't there? Because by this time it was apparent that Rover were not really getting on with the job of producing a production engine.
While the E-28 trials were going on, the real job was being badly hampered. Rover was supposed to be designing for production of the W2B engine, which was the engine intended for the Meteor, while Gloucester's was supposed to be producing the Meteor. Well, Gloucester's were getting on with the job fairly well, but Rovers were making an absolute nonsense of the engine. They just hadn't got the people who could do the job, and they thought they knew what to do, but well, an aeronautical engineer would understand what the position was, and I say they didn't even understand Bernoulli's theorem.
Right, fine, let's cover that. Now, what I'd like to do now is to get us really to where the engines are. You had a WU, we had a W2 and a W2B and an X. I get a bit confused by all this. Can you give me a description of what the basic engines in 1941 were and how they were coming along?
The first engine we call the WU. Then the W1X was a cross between the WU and the W1, the first flight engine. So the W1X was actually the second engine we built out of scrap and spares, and the W1 was the first real flight engine, very similar to the WU, but very much lighter in construction. But then we were designing for the Meteor fighter a more powerful engine, which we call the W2B, and that was the one that the Rovers were supposed to be putting into production.
Right. Now, perhaps you can tell us the main outline of the W2 for flying, the production engine, as it were.
The engine that was destined to be the power plant of the Meteor was a more powerful version of the experimental engine, really. There were no major difference. It looked quite similar from the outside. There were a lot of detailed differences, like the diffuser blades inside the compressor casing and so forth. The similarities were same kind of reverse flow combustion and the same basic turbine, but wider blades and fewer blades, that sort of thing, but really detailed changes.
What sort of thrust did you expect from it?
The W2B was designed for a thrust of 1,600 pounds, but it was a long time before we managed to get it.
And on the way, you had to overcome its surging problems, or attempt to overcome its surging problems. Tell me what surging is at the same time in your answer, please, Sir Frank.
One of the troubles we ran into quite unexpectedly on the engine which just preceded the W2B, which we call the W2, was surging. That is a temporary reverse flow in the compressor. If things are not quite in adjustment, if the turbine won't allow sufficient airflow through, then the compressor acts in an unstable fashion and you get a reverse flow. And it makes a considerable bang. It's very alarming. It was a case of trying to adjust, trying to match the turbine and the compressor. It was the failure to match that led to surging. As soon as one could get enough flow through the turbine to satisfy the then the surging problem disappeared.
Now, I get a bit lost in the narrative here because suddenly we come up with something called the B-26. Was that your design or somebody else's?
I haven't mentioned it.
So, no, I'm saying my own narrative in your book.
Oh,
we suddenly come up with. Is it something you don't want to deal with, or would you deal?
Well, please yourself.
Yeah. Well, somewhere along the line in the chronology, we go from the W2B to the B-26. Yes, what was there?
One of the bits of dirty work, you might call it, is that the rover company and us and Power Jets were supposed to be cooperating completely. We were supposed to be giving them all the information, and they were supposed to be giving us all the information. And we even had one of their engineers resident with us so that he could see what we were doing, so that they couldn't possibly say that we were withholding anything. Yet while all this was going on, they, with the knowledge of the Director of Engine Development in the Ministry, were designing their own version of the engine called the B-26, which differed quite considerably from the W2B in the sense that it had straight-through combustion, which the de Havilland Company were doing anyway. De Havilland were the first to do it. There was nothing novel about straight-through combustion, but we had not gone to it because we knew from our experience of combustion that any major change in the combustion chamber would cost years in extra development.
On the 1st of October 1942, at the north end of what we now know as Edwards Air Force Base, a covert aircraft sat inconspicuously, its true nature concealed by a fake propeller, lest any curious observers question its design. In a momentous event, it embarked on its inaugural short journey across the desert lake bed, introducing a novel sound to the Mojave Desert and the entire United States. This aircraft was the Bell XP-59A, the very first American jet. The pressing question lingered. Would it be prepared in time to exert a significant influence on the outcome of World War II? The National Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian Institution stands as the most frequented museum worldwide. Within its exhibits, it houses some of the most pivotal aircraft and spacecraft in the annals of history, representing the tireless efforts of men and women who have expanded the horizons of aviation. Among these treasures is the first of the Bell P-59 series, crafted with urgency and secrecy during the early years of America's involvement in World War II. It now graces the flight testing gallery of the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. The genesis of this endeavour can be traced back to a groundbreaking deal in which a jet engine initially designed in England was licensed for development by General Electric in the United States. The Bell Aircraft Company faced a daunting challenge, tasked with designing and constructing the airframe to harness the power of these revolutionary engines in just 6 months. These engines held the promise of a future marked by high-speed, high-altitude flight, rendering propellers obsolete and potentially bestowing a military advantage upon the Allies in their conflict with World War II adversaries. This is the saga of the Bell XP-59A and its profound impact on the narrative of aviation. Our tale commences in post-World War I England, where a young Frank Whittle's passion for airplanes propels him forward. Departing from traditional schooling, he embarks on an apprenticeship at Cranwell, the Royal Air Force College. His apprenticeship not only immerses him in the intricacies of aircraft engineering, but also unveils his innate talent. As he hones his engineering skills, Whittle delves into the theoretical aspects of his education. His seminal work, a 3-part scientific thesis titled Chemistry in the Service of the Royal Air Force, encompasses an extensive study of the atmosphere.
And I became fascinated by finding that at a height of 69,000 feet, the air density was exactly 1/16 of its sea level value. And that meant that it would be possible, theoretically, to fly 4 times as fast for the same drag as at sea level and get 4 times the lift. But unfortunately, I was rather depressed to realised that it also meant you need 4 times the power. And piston engines wouldn't even turn themselves over at 40,000 feet.
Later he thinks of putting a piston engine inside a hollow fuselage driving a fan. He rejects the idea, but not completely.
And then I suddenly thought, well, why not throw that piston engine away and substitute a turbine and boost the pressure of the fan? And that was it. That was the turbojet engine.
But there is no interest in the idea. Whittle is now a pilot, known as something of a daredevil. One notable incident during his journey involved a rather harrowing experience when his rear seat passenger unexpectedly tumbled out during takeoff. Whittle's quick thinking and skillful manoeuvring allowed him to land the aircraft with the passenger clinging precariously to the tail. Amidst these adventures, Whittle remained steadfast in his dedication to advancing the concept of the jet engine.
My brother officers were rather amused by the whole thing. It was known as Whittle's Flaming Touch Hole.
It was an astute fellow officer who recognized the potential and advised Whittle to secure a patent for his innovative idea, leading him to do just that.
And then shortly after that, he was sent to Cambridge for advanced engineering work because he'd shown a lot of engineering ability. And in fact, he was brought up his dad ran a machine shop, and he was mechanically inclined and a good engineer, basically.
In 1935, while pursuing studies at Cambridge, an old colleague offered his support in securing funding for the development of the jet engine. After months of tenacious effort, they achieved success.
And then in 1937, he formed his own little company, Power Jets Limited. Somebody put up about 10,000 pounds of capital, and he formed his company, even though he was still in uniform. And they let him work part-time on it.
Whittle established the headquarters of Power Jets in the quaint English village of Lutterworth, where he initiated the construction of his inaugural jet engine. After an intensive 7-year period of development and Whittle's relentless dedication, the jet engine was finally on the brink of becoming a tangible reality. By April 1937, it stood ready for crucial testing.
No one believed it would run at all. They didn't think it would even turn itself over. And quite a few people were gathered around to see me make a fool of myself. I was on the controls, and I gave the signal to turn the engine over, the big electric motor we had.
The following account is a reenactment captured on film depicting the events that transpired at Power Jets on the fateful day of April 12, 1937. Initially, all seemed to proceed as expected during the testing phase. However, an unexpected occurrence disrupted the proceedings, resulting in uncontrolled acceleration of the engine.
It accelerated out of control, and so did everyone standing around it. It still accelerated. That was a terrifying thing. I knew that it was going to work, but my impression from that first test is that we had a long way to go.
The issue causing this acceleration was eventually rectified, but at that juncture, Whittle faced an impending transfer to a different location, potentially taking him away from the engine development work he had devoted so much of his life to. He ran a demonstration for his commanding officers.
The engine ran at least well enough to let the powers that be continue on the job. I was excused my promotion examination to squadron leader and promoted to squadron leader, and placed on the special duty list to continue the work.
In 1938, the director of scientific research, who was sceptical about the engine, came to Lutterworth to see it run. It had now been completely rebuilt twice.
Well, I ran it for 20 minutes at near full speed, and he was at last converted, decided that we did have an aero engine, basis of a practical aero engine, and agreed that a flight engine should be ordered and an experimental aeroplane to test it.
But the world was changing rapidly. In September 1939, Adolf Hitler's blitzkrieg strategy unleashed a devastating wave of attacks in northern Europe, thrusting the continent into the throes of war. The long-anticipated conflict had become a harsh reality. catching many nations, including Britain, unprepared for the turmoil that lay ahead. In the early months of 1940, the Whittle W1 engine began to emerge as a potential game-changer in the military's eyes, a possible key to victory in the war. However, its full recognition and acceptance were still a distant goal. During this period, Britain's aerial defence against the formidable German Luftwaffe relied on the Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire fighters, which performed admirably but were closely matched by the German Messerschmitts in terms of performance. What Britain needed was a weapon capable of flying at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour and ascending to altitudes above 40,000 feet. By April 1941, the Gloucester Whittle E-28 had undergone successful taxi tests, with the inventor himself, Frank Whittle, occupying the cockpit for some of these trials. Nevertheless, even at this stage, official interest in the engine's first flight remained somewhat muted.
Certainly no important official had turned up to see that first flight, and they refused our request for an official photographer. And such rather poor film that exists was done by a handheld camera of someone from the Gloucester Aircraft Company.
On May 15th, Flight Lieutenant Jerry Sayer took the reins in the cockpit.
We went to the end of the runway, and we stood about a couple of hundred yards along by the side of the runway, and then he took off. It was quite unsensational. He took off beautifully, and he left the ground in about 600 yards, disappeared into the clouds, and we didn't see him for about 15 minutes, but we could hear him.
Embarking on a historic flight that proved to be a resounding success. Despite this triumph, the engine's full potential still eluded recognition. A peculiar turn of events transpired.
Our priority was taken away because they said everything must go into Spitfires and Hurricanes and so forth.
Leaving Whittle deeply disheartened. He earnestly desired for the engine to be taken to a secure location for further development.
Hap Arnold, the US Air Force general, got wind of it, you see, and he made a deal with the ministry.
They sent word over to General Arnold that they had a project that could conceivably affect the outcome of the war, and asked him to send a technical team over to evaluate it.
Fortunately, an evaluation of the engine yielded positive results, offering a glimmer of hope for the breakthrough that Whittle and his revolutionary jet engine had been striving for. In great secrecy, details of the engine were passed on to General Electric, with the object of building a test model and then producing the engine in America. General Electric was selected for its expertise in turbines, a technology closely aligned with the requirements of Whittle's jet engine. GE accepted this mission and embarked on a highly classified operation, taking delivery of a Whittle engine as the basis for their own production version. Secrecy remained paramount in their efforts. Simultaneously, Bell Aircraft established an isolated unit, shrouded in secrecy, tasked with the construction of America's inaugural jet aircraft.
Bell was selected as the contractor to build the airplane, because they'd shown a lot of innovative capability, and they had the capacity to take it on. The other builders of fighter airplanes were really loaded to the gills. Another reason for giving it to Bell was because Larry Bell was there to personally ride herd on the program.
However, on December 7th, 1941, the landscape shifted dramatically as Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor propelled the United States into World War II. Within General Electric, a secure unit was established to test the completed engine, aptly named for the confidential nature of its work. To further safeguard the project, engine manufacturing was decentralized, with various engine components assigned fictitious part numbers and produced at different locations within the factory. The GE workers remained unaware that they were contributing to the creation of America's first jet engine, with final assembly being the only step carried out behind closed doors. The outcome of this clandestine effort was the General Electric Type 1A engine, engineered to generate 1,250 pounds of thrust. Meanwhile, Bell Aircraft grappled with the formidable task of developing a new jet aircraft from the ground up in an astonishingly brief period of 6 months. Given its top-secret status, they couldn't even utilize government wind tunnels for testing. The design was ratified after the production of a single model, and manufacturing commenced on the production floor. As another secrecy measure, Bell's jet was given a misleading designation. Bell had abandoned a project for a piston-engine fighter called the P-59. The new jet was to be called the XP-59A. The setting is Edwards Air Force Base, situated in the Mojave Desert just north of Los Angeles. Today it serves as the epicenter of Air Force flight testing, harboring some of the most classified test projects. However, in the year 1942, it was nothing more than an expanse of barren desert.
The site was perfect for testing top-secret aircraft because it was so far away from everything. The lake bed was the other major factor because it provided a vast expanse of runway in any possible direction. In case an airplane, in this case a jet airplane, as with the P-59, flamed out, the pilot could make a dead-stick landing from almost any position around the lake bed. When the decision was made to locate the P-59 test program here at Muroc, there was nothing here in terms of test support facilities. And the need for security, this was after all a top secret program, dictated that the test site should be at some distance from the training base that existed here at that time. For that reason, they selected a site on the north shore of the lake bed.
When Bell's chief test pilot, Bob Stanley, arrived at Muroc Dry Lake to prepare for the covert jet tests, he had very little to start with.
The barrack was more or less completed. The water tower was completed. The hangar was not completed. It was a portable hangar which had lost a few of its parts along the way. And when Bob Stanley arrived, the place was a top secret site. They had to get rid of the construction crew, so Bob Stanley had to oversee the final construction of the hangar and the barrack. Now this included, among other things, all the electrical system. And Bob Stanley had quite a reputation amongst his fellow workers as being, first of all, a brilliant engineer, very fine test pilot, very hard-driving man, difficult man to work for, but brilliant. He seemed to know a little bit about everything.
In mid-September 1942, the inaugural Bell XP-59A made its way to Muroc. This remarkable aircraft had been transported discreetly by train from Buffalo, meticulously wrapped to safeguard its secrecy. It was subsequently offloaded, transported the final few miles to North Base, and painstakingly assembled. The team assembled at North Base consisted of representatives from Bell Aircraft, General Electric, and the Army Air Forces. Before the month's end, Bob Stanley's assessment indicated that the engines could be ignited for their initial tests within the aircraft. The realm of jet propulsion was so nascent that they resorted to applying paint strips on the fuselage near the jet exhaust to examine the impact of heating on the airplane's skin. Crew members were uncertain about the safe proximity to the jet exhaust and wondered about potential risks. They discovered that the airplane's skin could withstand the heat. And with caution, being in the vicinity of jets was not significantly different from working with conventional aircraft. The engineers from General Electric observed with apprehension, dealing with temperatures far higher than those found in piston engines, with the pressing need to ensure the durability of these new jet engines. By the close of September, Bob Stanley had executed a series of taxi tests, all of which yielded satisfactory results. Now he was on the brink of witnessing how America's inaugural jet aircraft would perform when it took to the skies. Early on the morning of October 1st, 1942, the XP-59A was wheeled out of the hangar for its first flight. The plan was cautious. The initial foray into the skies would be a low-altitude hop, and if it proceeded smoothly, Bob Stanley would undertake subsequent flights at higher speeds and altitudes. In some respects, the cockpit layout of the new jet aircraft was simpler compared to that of a piston engine plane. It featured fewer instruments to monitor engine performance. On the left side of the cockpit, two throttles were positioned, one for each engine. As Bob Stanley settled into the cockpit of the XP-59A on that October morning in 1942, he could hardly fathom the far-reaching impact that jet engines would soon have on global aviation. His focus was squarely on the upcoming minutes, navigating an untested aircraft. For the inaugural hop, the maximum altitude reached was a mere 25 feet, and the landing gear remained deployed. The following day, the altitude was raised, piquing the curiosity of those at South Base.
The combustion on this first engine was not very good, so there's heavy black smoke trailing behind it. It was particularly noticeable if you happened to be looking up the column from the back. From the side, you could see it, but if you were looking up that column, it really looked bad. And Bob hadn't been in the air more than 2 or 3 minutes, and the telephone rang. We got a call from the South Base. And this excited voice said, do you want some help? Can you send the fire people up? Walt said, no, what do you mean? Well, you got an airplane on fire. And he realized what it was. No, I think we can handle it all right. So then the guys, they knew we had a bunch of nuts up north if they took an airplane on fire that carelessly.
With these minor exceptions, the flights of October 2nd, 1942 were deemed successful. Bob Stanley completed 4 of them, ascending to a maximum altitude of 10,000 feet. Astonishingly, after just 3 hours of engine run time, the flight test program was temporarily halted.
And then we were running into a 3-hour limitation that GE imposed so they could, because of course the engine was far more experimental than the airframe. And after 3 hours of running, it's run-up time, taxi time, flight time. They insisted they must pull the engines out of the airplane, partially disassemble them, and inspect key parts for the effect of temperature and wear, which is all very, very logical.
Despite the relative isolation of North Base in Muroc, it wasn't entirely secure, as a nearby road led from the small town of Boron down to South Base.
With a road running by about just half a mile away from us in that clear desert air, a lot of mechanics lived at Boron, working down at the South Base, so they were going back and forth every day. Some of those individuals were bound to be propeller-oriented, and they were going to notice that there was no prop on this airplane, so we rigged up a little round ring with 4 balsa wood blades going out in 4 directions. So whenever the airplane sat outside the hangar, that was just stuck on the nose, so that anybody half a mile away, it took care of that emergency before it arose.
By the time the engines were ready for further testing, Muroc Dry Lake had become inundated, prompting a temporary shift of the testing program to drier ground. Again, the phony propellers were brought into service. The honor of making the first test flight for the military fell to Lawrence Craigie almost by default. 2 other pilots who would have preceded him were overseas at the time.
I did it more just in a normal matter of course, because I'd been living with the program all year, and was very close to all aspects of it. So with Swafford and Kern in England, it was the most natural thing in the world for me to be out there and be bossing the program from the Air Corps side.
Half a century later, his recollections are vivid.
In an ordinary airplane with a piston engine, the moment of takeoff is the moment of maximum vibration. And with this rotary device, and only operating at half power, it was very, very smooth. So as we broke ground and took off, it was just amazing, that feeling of quiet. So that was the impression I've always carried with me of that first flight. It was accentuated, of course, by the fact that we were only operating at half power. Again, GE's conservatism.
General Electric's specifications had initially promised 1,250 pounds of thrust per engine. totaling £2,500 for both engines. However, it soon became evident to those who piloted the XP-59A that the engines were falling far short of delivering the anticipated power.
We were a little bit concerned. We thought they were being a little over-conservative. We wanted to know just how much thrust we were getting, so Bob Stanley had him stick a metal fence post in the lake bed. We got a big spring scale. We attached it between the fence post and the airplane. We revved the engines up as high as GE would let us go. And we got a reading of 1,600 pounds on that spring scale. So we were getting 800 pounds of thrust per engine, which is not a hell of a lot.
The deficiency in engine performance began to pose a significant challenge, as the engines were producing barely more than half of the promised thrust. This lack of power translated directly into reduced performance capabilities for the aircraft. Despite these setbacks, the covert flight test program pressed on, operating out of South Base at Muroc Dry Lake. With new pilots joining the ranks and additional flights taking place, maintaining secrecy became increasingly challenging as inquisitive eyes drew nearer.
One of the gunnery students, the South Base, happened to be just taking off, and he saw a P-59 taking off up north, and he noticed this heavy cloud shadow on the lake bed following it, which got his attention. Of course, it was from this cloud of smoke behind the exhaust. And then as the airplane got in the air, he decided he was going to get a look at it in spite of the instructions he had, leave it alone. So he maneuvered his airplane so that he got pretty close to it up in the air, and he saw it had no prop. Then he got all excited, and when he landed, he told all of his buddies back there that he'd solved the mystery, that airplane didn't have a propeller. And they literally laughed him out of it, because it wasn't possible for an airplane to fly without a prop.
These new jet engines were very temperamental. It was a totally new technology. And the early engines were subject to flameouts, frequent flameouts. There was no way to restart the engines in flight. And hence, if you lost your engines, you needed a place to land and land quickly. The lake bed offered this opportunity to land in any direction, as long as you were flying within the vicinity of it.
It became evident that it was a very short-range affair, and this is where that unlimited expanse of lake bed paid off up there, because they thought nothing of just running a test until they ran out of gas. Stop, and they'd make a dead stick landing. In other words, just come in and land on the lake bed. They did this several times. Although it was not a dangerous airplane to fly, its handling characteristics were perfectly satisfactory, but it wasn't really a stable airplane, and it didn't come up to the performance handling qualities of an airplane like the P-38, the P-51, or the P-47.
The XP-59A encountered numerous minor issues, some of which were particularly discomforting in the scorching desert heat.
Temperatures in the cockpit were very high, and the reason for it was that the Bell had designed a double glass canopy with provisions to pipe hot gas from the engine compartment up in there to de-ice the winter and to keep it from frosting over. But the valve, which was supposed to be able to control it, wasn't functioning properly, so whether they wanted it or not, the hot air was coming through there all the time.
Tex Johnston, a test pilot at Bell Aircraft, was tasked with conducting altitude tests.
I was testing the airplane's stability and control performance in 5,000-foot increments up to ceiling altitude. And everything was going well, and when the Wright Field back at Dayton, the Air Force, got the data from the 30,000-foot flight, which has made propeller airplanes obsolete, you know. They said, go immediately to the ceiling. And I got to 46,000 feet, and the rate of climb was, I estimated, down to just 100, maybe 100, 150 feet a minute. So I said, that's it, that's the altitude, and that's 46,600 feet. And I stabilized out and recorded the data. And then I pulled the throttles back to start the let down. pulled them clear back to idle, and they still ran at full bore. And I could drop the nose just a few degrees, and I'd get into high-speed buffet. I'd pull it up and go a little bit too slow, and I'd get a low-speed buffet, which is stall warning, high-speed stall, low-speed stall. And of course, I could only estimate this, but from my experience, I knew that I had about a spread of about 35 miles an hour between high-speed stall and low-speed stall.
In response to these challenges, Tex devised a solution, temporarily disabling one of the engines, ensuring that it didn't affect the hydraulic systems.
With the one engine shut down, it decreased the thrust 50% so I can let down, and I was in high-speed buffet all the way until I got down to about 35,000 feet.
Few individuals were privy to the existence of the aircraft, but those in the know were eager to experience flight in this groundbreaking machine.
In the portion of the nose airplane that would house the armament section, the guns and ammunition and so forth, they installed a little cockpit just for an observer. And I've always felt that the primary reason for that really was to let Larry Bell fly in his airplane. But of course, it meant so much to him personally that his company had produced the first jet in this side of the world.
Larry Bell, the founder of Bell Aircraft, fulfilled his ambition by occupying the exterior cockpit and becoming one of the world's very first jet passengers. You can spot his flying helmet peeking above the front of the fuselage. Larry Bell was just one of several VIPs who were profoundly impressed by their flights in the aircraft's unique jump seat. Tex Johnston received the honor of taking a dignitary from Washington on a flight, and he chose a route along the highway to Boron for this significant journey.
And so I took him down this highway at full bore, right about 10 feet off the deck, so he's looking up the telephone post. And when they came back and landed, he got out and he said, "God damn, this son of a bitch went down the road, and the telephone line looked like a picket fence."
Performance on flight tests wasn't the leap forward that had been hoped for.
I guess we really weren't disappointed until we got well into the program when we realized that it just wasn't shaping up. We didn't begin to appreciate in the early days what a tremendous breakthrough it was going to be.
But on the other side of the Atlantic and the other side of the war, the potential of the jet had already been recognized. The world witnessed the first flight of the German Heinkel HE-178, the inaugural jet airplane in 1939. However, the genuine German threat emerged from the Messerschmitt Company, and their jet fighter entered service in mid-1944. By late that year, Allied intelligence officers began detecting peculiar signs and unusual reconnaissance photos. In response, they turned to Frank Whittle, Britain's pioneering figure in jet propulsion, for assistance.
I saw the photographs and was able to help interpret them. And they were plain enough with the double scorch marks of a twin-engine jet.
These markings and images were the handiwork of the Messerschmitt Me-262, the most renowned and effective German jet aircraft of the war. As early as 1938, Messerschmitt had been tasked with submitting a design for a fighter aircraft powered by 2 turbojet engines. At that time, German jet technology was still in its nascent stages. When the Me-262 was ready to take flight in early 1941, the engines designed for it weren't yet prepared. Consequently, it made its inaugural flights using piston engines and only transitioned to jet power in July 1942. Pilots who had the opportunity to fly the Me-262 for the first time experienced a remarkable leap in performance compared to piston engine fighters. It exhibited superb handling characteristics and remarkable speed. However, the Me-262 didn't officially enter service until July 1944, almost precisely 2 years after its maiden test flight. By that point, the war had taken a grim turn for Germany, and Allied air supremacy was so overwhelming that the limited number of Me-262s in combat could hardly alter the course of the war. The German Luftwaffe had not developed tactical strategies to fully exploit the Me-262's high-performance capabilities, and there was no comprehensive plan for its effective deployment. One of the intriguing what-if questions of World War II revolves around the possibility of the Me-262 being introduced into service earlier than it was. Would it have made a difference in the ultimate outcome of the war? It remains a tantalizing speculation and a subject of historical debate.
There were delays in that program, which are a little hard to explain later on, some of which were due to Hitler himself injecting himself into the program and decided that he wanted them to build bombers instead of fighters. So that delayed the program for probably 6 months. Even so, they did succeed, even in spite of all the difficulties they had in Germany with the war going against them. They built 1,200 of those airplanes. And fortunately for the Allies, only 200 of them ever saw service.
In war-ridden Germany, it took a long time to develop the jet engine to operational standard, and there were other reasons for the delay.
They were a successful airplane. See, they had logistic problems. They had pilot problems, and they had fuel problems, and they had logistic problems getting to use these airplanes, which is why they never used but 200 of the 1,200.
In the Mojave Desert in 1943, Bell Aircraft was having problems of its own and fulfilling the promise offered by jets as a weapon of war. There were now 3 prototypes of the Bell XP-59A under test. They had been developed in extreme secrecy and isolation without the benefit of normal design processes available to most advanced aviation projects in America. Even after months of flight testing in the desert, Bell and General Electric found themselves largely on their own, diligently refining the engine and airframe in relative isolation.
As the program developed, we wanted to give Bell some outside help. In fact, the normal thing in an experimental program would be for the airplane manufacturer to work with the NACA, utilize NACA's wind tunnels at Langley Field. But they were not allowed to do that. In fact, NACA knew nothing about this program. There probably weren't over a dozen or 15 individuals at Wright Field that knew of the existence of the program until long after the airplane flew.
In 1943, Larry Bell faced a challenge. He had been compelled to develop America's first jet aircraft secretly and address the inevitable teething problems that others could capitalize on in the future. Now, he needed to secure lasting benefits for his company. Even before the prototype had taken flight, Bell had received a production order for an additional 13 planes, designated as YP-59AEs for the Army Air Force's service trials. In 1943, as these planes became available, the initial impressions were confirmed. The potential of Bell's new jet as a game-changer or even a meaningful war participant was rather limited. In January 1944, the secrecy was finally unveiled, and it was publicly disclosed that America had a jet airplane. For months, the Bell Company had been striving to persuade the military to place a substantial order for the P-59. Back in mid-1943, Larry Bell had proposed to the Army Air Forces that they should order 300 of these airplanes. He spared no effort to convince both the Army and the Navy of the plane's value for the war effort. Bell's chief test pilot, Bob Stanley, conducted a series of demonstrations for military personnel. Only a handful of individuals had ever witnessed a jet aircraft in flight before. For nearly everyone present, it marked their first encounter with an aircraft devoid of propellers and the novel sound of a jet engine. However, despite the novelty of jet propulsion, it was unmistakably clear that the P-59 did not represent a significant advancement over the best Allied piston engine fighters. It couldn't justify a substantial production run. Eventually, the Army ordered 100 of them, but only around half that number would be manufactured. General Electric continued to develop the turbojet engine, fully aware of its promising future independent of the P-59's success or failure. For Bell, it was becoming evident that their first American jet was not going to be a resounding success. Other manufacturers were already nipping at Bell's heels. In early 1943, while Bell was still producing its 13 YP-59As, Lockheed had been invited to submit a design for a single-seat jet fighter. As the production run of P-59s commenced at the Bell factory in Buffalo, more and more military personnel came into contact with these aircraft daily. Nevertheless, it took a significant amount of time for the news of this transformative power to reach those still engaged in remote overseas battlefronts.
I didn't know a thing about it, and none of the pilots did. In fact, I recall when there was a magazine called Impact. It was an intelligence magazine that was circulated in the Air Force. And I remember sometime in 1944, toward the end, I saw a copy of it and had a picture of a P-80 in it. And I thought they were just, trying to fool somebody.
In England, development on the jet engine had been proceeding independently. A new airframe had been produced by the Gloucester Company. Powered by 2 jets, it was called the Gloucester Meteor, and its performance was very impressive. The Gloucester Meteor, which entered service late in World War II, possessed the speed necessary to chase and intercept the German V-1 flying bomb. British pilots devised a special technique to deal with this menace. While shooting down the V-1 was hazardous for pilots who had to fly through the explosion, they discovered that if they positioned their Meteor's wingtip under the V-1, they could tip it off balance, causing it to fall out of the sky. As the war approached its conclusion in the United States, more and more young pilots began to experience the exhilaration of flying an aircraft without a propeller. 20 P-59As and 30 P-59Bs were put into service. However, they were not destined for combat or to have any direct impact on the war's outcome. Instead, they were employed to acquaint pilots with the handling and performance of jet aircraft.
The P-59 was sort of the first jet and a good one to transition into by people who had flown conventional airplanes. And that's more or less where it stayed. It never was built for a combat airplane. It was a very easy airplane to fly, a very pleasant one, but it didn't have striking performance. Very short-legged, could have used more fuel. You had to be careful with fuel control. The fuel controls were not adequate, and you stayed away from sudden bursts of the throttle because you might have a flame out.
Don Lopez, who had returned from service in China flying P-40 fighters, got his opportunity to fly a P-59.
I was really excited to get to fly a jet because there were very few of them. And I remember it has such a big wing, a tremendously big wing from fore and aft, a lot of chord. And it seemed like you were stepping down into a bathtub or something into the cockpit. But when you started the engine, you just pushed the button and one engine started, then you pushed the other. And you could almost only tell it by the instruments. There was hardly any noise. And you had to give it almost full throttle to get it to taxi, to move. And when you lined it up with the runway then, and you didn't have to warm up or check your engine. If it's running, it's running. And you line up with the runway, give it full power and let go of the brakes, and hardly anything happened. Then you just gradually start moving down the runway. It felt sort of like you were being towed by an invisible tow plane. And it lifted in the air because it had a lot of lift with the big wing. And it handled all right. It wasn't terribly fast. It was maybe a little faster than a Mustang, but and you could only stay up about 30 minutes because it ran out of fuel. But just being a jet was very interesting. But it didn't handle that well like a real fighter.
Nevertheless, there was already a new U.S. jet aircraft in operation that resembled a genuine fighter and exceeded the capabilities of any American fighter to date. This aircraft, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, boasted remarkable performance and handling characteristics that surpassed the Bell P-59. Despite its rapid construction, with a prototype built in just 143 days and its first flight on January 8, 1944, the P-80 came too late to have any impact on the war.
At the end of the war, we had one P-80 in Italy and one P-80 in England as a morale factor for our pilots who were running into 262s. And what are we doing?
In 1946, the first national air races since the commencement of the war were held. Enormous crowds relished the opportunity to witness the remarkable advances in aviation that had occurred during the war years. The P-80 was one of these standout attractions, as it was both exciting to watch and to fly.
My first flight in the P-80, I literally felt when we got off the ground in the air as if I was literally 6 or 8 feet behind the airplane trying to catch up with it, because it had that tremendous thrust.
I loved it. It handled very well, very maneuverable, very small, tight cockpit. You really felt like you were in a fighter, and it just was you climbed at 380 miles an hour, which was about 180 miles an hour faster than the P-40 cruised, and it just was a great airplane. I liked it very much. You felt like you belonged in it when you first got in it.
Immediately following the war, captured German aircraft were flown into France as part of Operation Lusty. This included numerous Me-262s, although not all of them were recovered with complete success. These airplanes were then shipped to America and put through a testing program. Rochelet flew an Me-262.
Performance-wise, it was a great airplane. It had great flotation. You could land on unprepared runways. Oddly, it had a nose wheel brake as well as the main wheel brakes, where you could get it stopped in a hurry. It had great firepower, devastating firepower, with the 4 cannons in the nose. It had long range. The shortcomings were it had 20-hour engines. We'd have to change the engines after about 20 hours.
So in 4 years, since the XP-59A was rolled out in secret in the Mojave Desert, it had not achieved as much as other early jets. So what exactly does the Bell P-59 Aerocomet mean in the annals of aviation history?
Had the airplane been developed in a normal fashion, with all of the wind tunnels of NACA and all of the capabilities of NACA and the Air Force available to it, a lot of these things would have been discovered and would not have existed in the airplane. So it was not a successful military airplane, but it was the beginning. It was the first jet in this country, and Bell truly did a remarkable job under almost unbelievably difficult circumstances with security and the other hamstrings that they were subjected to.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.